So it's my pleasure at this time to introduce the introducer of the guest speaker, the Vice Chief of the Navy, Admiral Bill Moran. Thank you very much.
Well, good evening, everybody. Can you all hear me? I know Bill can. You can hear me, right? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So I had the real privilege of meeting Bill Norberg for the first time earlier this evening, and we were just chatting, and he said, "Yeah, I come to a lot of these things, and we got to get these speakers to stop being blowhards and be short." So, sir, I am going to oblige you tonight. Be real short. I have an easy job. I get to introduce our guest speaker. But before I do that, let me thank Rookie and the team here. Just a fabulous job putting this thing together. Great turnout, great place. Thank you, sir. So I'm here representing our Chief of Naval Operations, John Richardson, who is in San Diego on the Midway to celebrate Midway. And our Director of the History and Heritage Center over on the Navy Yard, retired Rear Admiral Sam Cox, is on the island of Midway, where he is helping to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Midway. And we're going to simulcast them all together tomorrow morning at the Navy Memorial to bring Midway back to life from the actual island of Midway. So what could go wrong? It's going to be a great event. The sea of white continues, right, Frank? Frank Thorpe, who's running that wonderful place now. Thanks for being here, Frank. So events like this, I get all emotional. I mean, I see a former Chief of Naval Personnel back there. Anybody who's been involved in the business of people, and that's anybody in this room, it gets pretty emotional when you take into consideration what the 6 men who are here with us tonight had lived through, contributed to, been part of, just in the Battle of Midway, but almost the entire war. It's truly humbling to be around every single one of you in your various roles in the United States Navy. The thing that's most impressive, though, and most important for all of us, is that we that currently serve, wear the uniform, and any generation that's come along since the Civil War and the Revolutionary War, is that we need to understand that the character of our Navy has always been about taking care of each other, being shipmates for each other, about fighting as a team together, not taking credit other than a team credit. All of those things were cemented in our history in the Battle of Midway. Just think about just less than 2 months before Midway was the Battle of Coral Sea. Think about that. Incredible how fast those two things put us on a collision course with the Japanese Navy after Pearl Harbor. And just like every generation before them and since them, these men and women rose to the occasion to make our great Navy live up to the character and competence that we are sailors in our great Navy. And so when we think about capturing sea stories, which we're all great about doing, after all, you're not a sailor if you can't tell those stories. And there are a lot of them floating around here this evening. Great stories. But there's nobody that I've come across in reading naval history, and albeit my reading of naval history is not quite up to the level of John Richardson or John Harvey and a few others that I've met over the years. But Ian Toll is a master at telling stories. Telling stories about our Navy during that critical time when the war in the Pacific literally turned on its head and we gained the advantage and we gained the momentum. Otherwise, there's a good chance we wouldn't be sitting here. And Ian's done a magnificent job through his books, and he continues to write. He's finishing up the third in his trilogy on the war. I got introduced to his writing in the 6 frigates. I think many of you have. I think John Harvey actually gave me that book and said, you need to read this. And if you've ever worked for John Harvey, you just say yes, sir, and move on. And I did. And there's a lot of great history in that book, but it's the beginnings of our Navy all the way through tonight's culmination, if you will, in the Battle of Midway. So Ian, it is our honor and our privilege that you would join us here tonight to help tell some more stories that we can all take back with us and continue to build on the great legacy that we call the United States Navy and our Marine Corps team that is here with us tonight. And by the way, Tim Hannafin sitting right behind you. Tim gave me a copy of Neptune's Inferno back when we were working together in the N9 organizations a few years ago. And here I thought the Battle of Guadalcanal was a Marine Corps fight until I read Neptune's Inferno. So, shipmate, thanks a lot for making me smarter about that. But it just goes to show you how powerful, well-written stories about our people and the battles that made our Navy great can be, should be, and must be as long as we have a Navy. So if you would all join me in a rousing welcome for Mr. Ian Toll, who will tell us some more sea stories tonight. Ian, please stand.
Thank you very much, Admiral Moran, and thank you all for having me here tonight to talk a little bit about the Battle of Midway. It's a great honor to me to be invited to share some of my research and my work now going on 10 years about the Pacific War, and particularly to meet our Midway veterans. And I'd just like to ask for one more round of applause for our several Midway veterans. More shipping went out under the Golden Gate Bridge to the Pacific in between 1942 and 1945 than ever before in history. And today, just near the San Francisco side of the Golden Gate Bridge, there is I think you would call it a sculpture, but it's also, in a way, a kind of an engineering demonstration. And what it is a steel lattice beam of the same type that is used to support the bridge. So it's a big, massive steel beam that's kind of half bent. And if you go and you read the inscription under this beam, what it will tell you is that this was the result of a stress test that was done at the Berkeley School of Engineering. And these Berkeley engineers had placed 8 million pounds of weight on this beam to see what it would do. And it had buckled, but held up. And the reason I wanted to begin with that image is because I think when people ask me, why have you spent so many years of your life studying war? War does to societies and to systems of government and to countries and to individuals what those Berkeley engineers did to that beam. They place great pressure by placing great pressure on an object like that, you gain information about it, don't you, that you wouldn't gain in any other way. This is why military history, I think, is unique. It's why it's especially important to study the history of war in order to understand how does a society hold up under great pressure. War is a force that has shaped our history and all history. It's a test of nations, of systems of government, of societies. And how a nation conducts itself in an emergency gives you information about it that you cannot get from studying that same subject during a time of peace. War is always tragic. It leaves devastation and sorrow in its wake, but it has always been with us. Some wars have been necessary. Our Revolutionary War was necessary. Our Civil War, the Second World War. This country and its allies got rid of German fascism and Japanese ultranationalist imperialism, which had left a trail of misery and devastation across the world. Ben Franklin once wrote that there was never a good war or a bad peace. And although I have a great deal of respect for Ben Franklin, I don't agree with him. I think the peace that preceded the Second World War was a very good example of a bad peace. The Second World War in the Pacific was, by really a vast margin, the largest naval war ever waged. It was the only naval war that has ever been fought across the breadth and length of the Pacific, an ocean so large that you could fit all of the world's combined land masses into it with room to spare. And of course, the war began with Japan's devastating surprise strike on our great Pacific bastion at Pearl Harbor, which knocked all 8 battleships of the Pacific Fleet out of action in the first 15 minutes of the war. And of course, this was the event that brought us very suddenly into this global war that we had previously resisted entering. It was the real turning point of the Second World War, not the turning point for us, but the turning point for the world, because it brought this country, the only country that when fully mobilized had the power to subdue the Axis countries into the war, and brought it into the war in a way that ensured that we were united and committed to victory. It was the beginning of an era of internationalism, American internationalism, that continues in this, to this day, and that we hope will continue in the future. And what was left in the aftermath of that cataclysmic defeat were aircraft carriers and submarines. The battle line was knocked out. And although 5 of those 8 battleships would eventually be returned to action, the loss of those battleships on the first day of the war forced our naval leadership to make radical changes to the way in which they had contemplated fighting this war. It forced the Navy to let go of traditional naval doctrines, to develop and refine new technologies, weaponry, doctrine, aviation, carrier warfare, submarine warfare, radar, radio intelligence, and the stupendous logistics and supply problems involved in pushing a fighting force across the interminable distances of the Pacific. This great shock, the loss of our battleships in the heart of our great Pacific base, was a fundamental challenge to the old Mahanian idea. That is the idea promulgated by Alfred Thayer Mahan, the great naval historian and theorist, also a naval officer, that the battleships were the heart of any Navy's fighting power. And even worse, even more shocking, was the fact that this defeat had been dealt against us by Japan, with timing that could not have been any worse. In the week immediately before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Navy Secretary Frank Knox had launched a media offensive to reassure the country that the Navy had nothing to fear from the Japanese. In Collier's magazine, a week before Pearl Harbor, in an article with the regrettable title, "The Navy is Ready," Knox had predicted that the U.S. Navy would, quote, knock Japan out of the water. And before the war, the Americans and our British allies had taken comfort in a widely held conviction that the Japanese were simply not to be taken seriously, and this was especially true of Japanese air power. The Japanese air forces, we allowed ourselves to believe, amounted to a few cast-off, obsolete European planes piloted by crash test dummies. And that impression had been nourished by quackish and pseudo-scientific theories that had been offered by so-called experts of various fields. The Japanese, we were told, would always make bungling pilots because they suffered from innate physiological defects. They were cross-eyed and nearsighted, possibly a symptom of their slanted eyes. As infants, they had been carried on the backs of their mothers, causing their heads to wobble in a way that threw off the balance in their inner ears. Western aviation journals cited statistics which purported to show that the Japanese aviation crash rate was the highest in the world. And it was acknowledged that Japan had developed a self-sufficient aircraft manufacturing industry, and this was a remarkable achievement even then, our experts would admit. But the idea that the Japanese might build planes that were any good was simply held to be beneath consideration. And this was the view that prevailed, not just in our Navy, but across really our entire, all of our armed forces, right up until December 7th, 1941. And so it was only after the shocking losses that we suffered on that day in Pearl Harbor that it began to dawn on the Americans and our British allies that we had perhaps seen only what the Japanese had wanted us to see. That perhaps their high aviation crash rate might have something to do with the fact that they were training quite a bit harder than we were. And we might have liked to dismiss Pearl Harbor as a kind of lucky sucker punch. But on the first day of the war, throughout the Western Pacific, land-based units of the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a tightly choreographed aerial blitzkrieg against American and British bases throughout the region. And by the end of the first day of the war, literally the same day as the attack on Pearl Harbor, half of the air power defending the Philippines was gone. Most of it destroyed on the ground. In Malaya, the British air defenses fared no better. RAF fighters engaged enemy bombers and Zeros in a pitched air battle north of over Kota Baru on the northeast coast of the Malayan Peninsula, where a Japanese invasion force was put ashore on the first day. And the result was another lopsided victory for the Japanese. Japanese medium bombers took off from bases in Indochina or Vietnam, struck Singapore more than 600 miles away, and the raid came as a bolt out of the blue because the British had not even considered the possibility that Japanese airplanes could reach across such a distance to strike them. This air offensive essentially wiped out Allied air power throughout the Western Pacific in the first 2 weeks of the war. And this was a defeat more ruinous in its consequences than the raid on Pearl Harbor because it led directly to the fall of the Philippines and Malaya. The Allies had insisted on holding the Japanese in contempt, but in fact they learned the hard way that Japanese naval aviators were among the very best pilots in the world. Many had flown more than 100 aerial combat missions over China since 1937, accruing an average of 500 to 600 hours in the cockpit. Working in obsessive secrecy, the Japanese had built some of the finest military aircraft in the world. The Mitsubishi A6M-0 was a dogfighting champion, an aerial acrobat that outturned, outclimbed, and outmaneuvered any fighter plane the Allies could send against it. Washington had received intelligence reports about this aircraft, which had been in service for some 18 months in China. But apparently our analysts could not bring themselves to believe that the Japanese were capable of building an aircraft that could climb at a rate of 3,000 feet per minute. And so for a year and a half, the Zero remained almost completely unknown in Allied aviation circles. And American and British pilots had received no useful information about it before being pitted against it in the sudden crucible of this war. It was yet another example of the fatal hubris of the West in the face of plentiful evidence that the Japanese threat was much more severe than they had anticipated. And this was an attitude that would cost the lives of many hundreds of Allied pilots in the early months of the Pacific War. I think many of the people in this room have probably learned a lot about the Battle of Midway, read about it, seen documentaries. There are several men here who participated in the battle. I think to really understand the significance, the unique significance of this battle, it's important to go back to these early days of the Pacific War. The Battle of Midway in June 1942, 75 years ago today, was just 6 months after that attack on Pearl Harbor. Think about that. It's an extraordinarily short period of time. And what an extraordinary counterpunch for us to have scored so soon after having suffered this devastating surprise raid at the beginning of the war. The raid on Pearl and the devastating effect of that raid forced this country very quickly after December 7th to accept that our assumptions about the Japanese had been not just wrong, but spectacularly wrong, and that we had invited our disastrous defeats by our own hubris. We had to swallow a bitter pill to accept the hard truth that at the outset of the war, the Japanese were not only more ready, but they were, in a fundamental sense, really better. It was a better Navy than ours. Alvin Kernan, who was an ordnanceman on the Enterprise, said that 6 weeks after Pearl Harbor, he and his shipmates had come around to understand that, quote, theirs was a better Navy than ours, better aircraft, better trained personnel, better night training, better torpedoes by far. But it was fortunate that the Americans let go of their pre-war hubris quickly, because it left every man in the fleet with this bracing realization that each man individually would have to do his own part to lift the Navy's game. The generation of naval leaders who led the Navy during that war were born in the 1880s and passed through the Naval Academy right around the turn of the 20th century. Chester Nimitz, class of 1905, many of his colleagues, Spruance, Halsey, King, Leahy, all of those admirals who reached 3- and 4-star rank and 5-star rank during the Second World War had passed through the Naval Academy at a time when we still had coal-burning battleships as the essential heart of our battle line. The Wright brothers got off the ground in 1903. That was Nimitz's second year at the Naval Academy. Consider the entire history of naval aviation was encompassed within the careers of these men. Other services often said that the Navy had a particular kind of inward-looking, insular, sort of parochial attitude. Henry Stimson, who was the Secretary of War during the Second World War, said that he thought the service rivalries inevitably that were fought during the Second World War were mainly to be blamed on the Navy Department, which he said, and I'm going to try to remember the quote exactly because it was a pretty good one, was that there was a peculiar attitude in the Navy Department that Neptune was God, Mahan was his prophet, and the United States Navy was the one true church. And that was a pretty good one for Secretary Stimson. He was the Secretary of War because we didn't have a Secretary of Defense. The War and Navy departments were separate and co-equal. So he was the Army Secretary, which was then a cabinet rank position. And of course, a Navy partisan would have a quick answer, wouldn't we? General MacArthur seemed to be a kind of messiah in his own right. So these kinds of attitudes certainly were not unique within the Navy. But I think one of the issues that hasn't received nearly as much attention as it should in the World War II historical literature is the issue of how the military services dealt with the issue of press, PR, and inevitably politics. Almost entirely neglected. The attitude within the Navy was one that you should have essentially nothing at all to do with the press. You should treat reporters as if they're lepers, and you should use force, if possible, to keep them out of your way. And the attitude in the Army was somewhat different, and that was particularly true in Brisbane, where General MacArthur had his headquarters. Of course, the Pacific was divided into two theaters under the system that was set up. Admiral Nimitz had command north of the equator and in part of the South Pacific. And General MacArthur had command in the South Pacific. And this divided theater command was a necessity essentially for the political reason that General MacArthur was both senior and was immensely popular with the American people. He was a celebrity in his own right. And Admiral Nimitz, who was a modest and retiring personality, who did not want to play this game, had a much lower profile. The attitude of Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations during the war, was summed up by one of his colleagues who said, King's idea of public relations is to tell the press nothing at all about what was happening until the end of the war, and then to put out a two-word communique, we won. And of course, if you have two different military services who are playing the game in two very different ways, this is going to create an imbalance which will lead inevitably to significant pressures, and that's what happened in the Pacific. And at the juncture of war fighting and politics, there is some very interesting work to do for future historians, I think, of this war. And there is an idea that we know all there is to know about the Second World War, and I don't believe that that is true. MacArthur became a dark horse candidate for the Republican nomination for president in 1944. This was never a realistic prospect, but it was one that was pursued avidly by his supporters here in Washington. And although MacArthur covered his tracks very carefully, he was certainly willing to be put into a position of potentially accepting a call to run for president against FDR in 1944. And so as much as we would like to think of this country as being completely united during this war, in fact, these divisions were here. To his credit, FDR repeated a joke frequently that had come from Guadalcanal. Two Marines at Henderson Field were talking. The original form of the joke was, if you want to get a job, I'll tell you how to do it. But I won't say that. I'll say, one Marine says to the other, if you want to kill a Japanese soldier, I'll tell you what to do. Walk up to the top of that hill. Shout, to hell with Hirohito. And the Japanese soldier, because his emperor is also his god, is going to be enraged and is going to come charging out of the bush, and then you can shoot him. So the Marine says, yeah, I'd like to do that. So he walks up the hill. And he shouts, to hell with Hirohito. And then louder, to hell with Hirohito. And the Japanese soldier pops his head up and he says, to hell with FDR. So the Marine slings his rifle over his shoulder. He walks back down the hill, but he says, Well, I didn't hear a shot, so what happened? And he said, well, I know we're supposed to win this war, but I'll be damned if I'm going to shoot another Republican. So keep in mind when you think about what Admiral Nimitz, Admiral King, Admiral Halsey, Admiral Spruance, and the many other senior leaders of the Navy during that war were up against. They had to deal with all of this as well. The quality of the leadership, I think, is something that you have to pause and think a little bit about what these guys had done and seen over the course of their career to consider what they achieved, the pace of change in their profession over the course of the time that they were in the service. Graduated the Naval Academy at a time when we had coal-burning, reciprocating engines in our battleships, the conversion to fuel oil, at a time when submarines were experimental, in which they posed a greater danger to their own crews than to the enemy, when the self-propelled torpedo was really a brand new weapon. Radio was a brand new technology when they entered their naval careers. The first time that radio would be used to communicate between ships at sea was in the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, 1905. And because radio was new, of course, the whole field of communications intelligence was also something that lay in the future. All of these changes occurred in the course of their careers. They were rising through the ranks at a time when the pace of technological change was headlong, and they had to constantly adapt and to stay current in order to lead effectively. By April 1942, just 4 months into the war, Japan had conquered one of the largest empires ever to be brought under one flag. Its vast perimeter stretched from the Kuril Islands in the north to Timor in the south, from the Gilbert Islands in the east to the frontiers of India in the west. And there were pockets of Allied resistance here and there across this empire, notably on Bataan and Corregidor in the Philippines, but they could not hold out much longer. And the Japanese had conquered territories that were rich in the natural resources that they did not possess in their home islands and other territories. Oil in the Dutch East Indies, rubber, tin, bauxite, and Malaya. They could feed these vital imports into their war machine, and they believed they could hold off whatever kind of counterattack we might be able to send against it. Most extraordinarily, this new Japanese empire had been won at a negligible cost. Their casualties ran only to about 10,000 in the first 4 months of the war. Their total shipping losses had amounted to about 25,000 tons, and the Imperial Japanese Navy was virtually unscathed. They had lost one destroyer off of Wake Island. But now it was the Japanese who allowed themselves to indulge in hubris and to underrate their opponents. The Japanese people were rapidly succumbing to a syndrome that they later called cerebro, or victory disease. And this was a faith that Japan was invincible, that Japan's extraordinary conquests had been achieved because this was a nation divinely ordained to dominate in Asia. And its symptoms were overconfidence, a failure to weigh risks properly, a contempt for the enemy, and a basic misunderstanding of our will to fight back in the Pacific. They had tested Allied strength in the Pacific and found it surprisingly feeble, so feeble that it seemed that the deficiency could only be explained by some inherent flaw, perhaps, in our moral fiber. And their propaganda told their people and us that Allied soldiers and sailors were weak and craven, interested only in saving their own lives. Speeches and editorials in Japan declared that the war was as good as won, that a strong perimeter had been captured and fortified, and that no major counteroffensive was to be expected. And the American carriers had survived, and this was important, not because our few carriers in the Pacific in early 1942 really had the power to strike any great decisive blow against the Japanese, but because they had the mobility and the range to strike in many different places, far from our basis of support. Carrier planes struck Japanese positions north and south of the equator in the Marshalls in February 1942, Wake Island, the waters east of Rabaul, Marcus Island in March, at Lae and Salamaua on New Guinea, also in March. And although none of these raids did a great deal of damage, and did nothing at all to slow the pace of the Japanese advance, they reminded the leadership in Tokyo that the American flat tops, having survived by a lucky fluke on December 7th, posed an ever-present threat. In mid-March, largely because of his determination to get rid of these hated American aircraft carriers, Admiral Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, insisted that the full strength of his fleet be mobilized for an attack on Midway Atoll in the outer chain of the Hawaiian Islands. And his real objective was to flush the American fleet out of Pearl Harbor and to destroy those carriers in a pitched battle. And he met with considerable skepticism and resistance from the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. This was the Japanese Joint Chiefs, who raised a number of very prescient objections to this proposed Midway operation. But Yamamoto insisted that it was necessary in order to secure the eastern flank of the empire and critically to deal with this constant threat posed by the aircraft carriers on cue, as if to make his point for him. The carriers Enterprise and Hornet, in a combined operation with the Army Air Forces, launched 15 Army B-25 bombers from the deck of the Hornet. These planes hit targets in Japan and landed in China or bailed out. In that raid, the Doolittle raid, named for the Army Air Forces Colonel James Doolittle, who led it, was a disastrous loss of face for the Japanese Navy and caused essentially a political crisis in Tokyo. And any remaining opposition to Yamamoto's proposed Midway operation vanished, and the offensive was scheduled for the first week of June 1942. Underappreciated in our literature, especially until recently, is that these carrier raids served another vital purpose, and that was that every time we hit a Japanese base with our aircraft carriers, it caused a surge in Japanese radio traffic. And that Japanese radio traffic could be linked by our analysts to known locations and events and ships and other units. And raw radio traffic that could be linked to known places and events was grist for the mill of our communications intelligence analysts. American code breakers achieved one of the most important contributions to the American victory in the Pacific by peeling back the layers of encryption that cloaked Japanese naval communications. Led by Joseph Rochefort, a 41-year-old commander of the Pearl Harbor Communications Intelligence Unit, launched a campaign to decipher 50,000 five-digit numeral groups in the Japanese code. And even as the Japanese code began to yield up its secrets bit by bit, blank by blank, the analysts had to mainly work with induction. They had to take a few fragments of information and then run it through a kind of analytical process that relied heavily on common sense and on the operational experience of the analysts, who were, to a man, naval officers with extensive experience at sea. Rarely did all of the available evidence point in one direction. More often there were red herrings. And the analysts had to sift through huge amounts of raw data and develop theories from evidence that did not always point in one direction. This was one of the greatest intellectual achievements in all of military history. At first, the decrypted code groups were like plain text islands in a sea of indecipherable code. But even a small island supplied a foothold for logical deduction. And with time, the sea began to fall, and the islands merged into their neighbors. Theories were checked against traffic analysis and sighting reports. Each new triumph of the codebreakers boasted their conviction and the deductions they could not yet prove. One of Rochefort's top lieutenants compared the sensation of cracking one of the Japanese code groups after many weeks of frustration to a sexual orgasm. Physiologically, it's not the same, he was quick to say. But the emotional feeling is pretty much the same. By April, the codebreakers were reading enough of the Japanese traffic to forecast 2 Nimitz. The MO operation, this was a major Japanese amphibious operation in the South Pacific aimed at capturing Port Moresby on the coast of New Guinea. And in the first week of May, American and Japanese carrier groups clashed in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Coral Sea, less than a month before Midway. It's often said was something new under the sun. It was the first naval battle in history in which the opposing ships never gained sight of one another. It was entirely fought by aircraft. It was also one of the most confused and confusing battles in the history of naval warfare, characterized on both sides by an extraordinary series of miscommunications and miscalculations. In immediate material terms, Coral Sea was a victory for the Japanese because they managed to sink the venerable old carrier Lexington. The Americans sank a light carrier, the Shoho, 1 light cruiser, 2 destroyers, a transport, and 4 gunboats. But although the Japanese had come out ahead in the tally of ships, they had lost twice as many aircraft and suffered twice as many casualties, and most importantly, failed to capture Port Moresby, and this was the first reversal in the 5-month Japanese offensive. Critically, 2 of the big Japanese carriers, although not sunk, were damaged, and as a result of being damaged, were not available for the Battle of Midway, which occurred less than a month later. I think it's important to understand the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Battle of Midway, were 2 battles that should always be understood as being linked in history. In a sense, they were one battle fought over a period of less than a month. And thanks to these remarkable efforts of the codebreakers, Admiral Nimitz had effectively complete foreknowledge of the Japanese plan to attack the atoll of Midway on June 4th, 1942. And in arranging his forces, Nimitz concentrated on one overriding objective over all others: to ambush and destroy the Japanese carriers. He ruthlessly subordinated every other objective in making his strategic plan. He placed his 3 available carriers on Admiral Nagumo's port flank, distant enough to avoid early detection, close enough to launch a punishing attack. Caught between 2 large waves of American dive bombers, SBD, Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and the Yorktown, the Japanese lost 3 carriers in a sudden attack lasting just 5 minutes. And by the end of the day, 4 of Japan's largest and finest fleet carriers had been sent to the bottom of the North Pacific. We had won our stunning victory at the cost of the carrier Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond sunk, 145 planes destroyed, 307 men killed in action. And we had needed more than a few strokes of good luck to win that battle. The Japanese search planes did not find the American carriers early enough to allow Admiral Nagumo to launch a counterstrike. The American dive bombers, which were the most potent weapon in the American arsenal, arrived over the enemy at just the right time and in the right sequence, when the Zeros had been spread far and wide at low altitude to deal with previous air attacks. Admiral Raymond Spruance later wrote that he had done nothing brilliant at the Battle of Midway. He had executed the blueprint that he had been handed by Nimitz, and he had been lucky. "We were shot with luck in the morning of June 4th, he wrote, when the fate of the operation was decided. As for his own role in the action, Spruance said, all that I can claim credit for myself is a very keen sense of the urgent need for surprise and a strong desire to hit the enemy carriers with our full strength as early as we could reach them. As momentous as it was, Midway did not in itself turn the tide of the Pacific War. The American mobilization at home was proceeding, but it would require at least another 6 months for its effects to be felt on the distant frontiers of the Pacific theater. Yamamoto had gambled on knocking the American Navy out of the war, and he had lost. He would never again muster the forces to mount a sustained offensive against any Allied territory. Midway ensured that the Pacific War would become a prolonged war of attrition, precisely the sort of war that Yamamoto had warned against and had most feared. This country's latent military industrial strength would eventually overwhelm the Japanese. Our economy was about 10 times larger than theirs. But the Japanese willed themselves to believe for the remainder of the war that their unique Yamato spirit must deliver ultimate victory. They believed themselves to be a race like no other, a family of 100 million, as they said. The figure was about 30 million too high, racially pure, homogeneous, descended from the gods, united under the benevolent guidance of a father emperor, the only nation in which the king was a god and the god was also the king. The ideology was reinforced and disseminated by official slogans, 100 million advancing like a ball of flame, think as one, act as one, 100 million bodies, one brain. Extravagance is the enemy. Fired with overriding spirit, the Japanese at home and on the front lines would endure privations and hardships that the enemy could never withstand. They would work harder, they would eat less, they would face death with samurai-like indifference. Their new ethic was derived from traditional samurai and Zen ideas. At the same time, it was a monstrous perversion of their own traditions. The Japanese militarists, who did not have to argue with anyone because no other dissenting views were permitted to be heard, characterized this country in the following way. We were a mongrel people, hopelessly individualistic and democratic, pitted against one another in bitter capitalist competition. We lacked the intangible spiritual qualities to prevail over a united country like Japan. Eventually, we would tire of the fight and go home. Our women had political power, and they would demand, once their sons and husbands and brothers began to die, that the war should be brought to a negotiated conclusion. And of course, if this premise had been correct, Japan's fighting spirit paradigm would undoubtedly have won the war, or at least have resulted in a negotiated peace that would allow Japan to maintain some portion of the empire it had conquered. Latent industrial military strength is mainly what we had in the early days of that conflict. But from the day Nagumo's carriers attacked Pearl Harbor, there was never any realistic prospect that the United States would fail to conquer and subjugate Japan. The American conception of fighting spirit was very different from that of the Japanese. But once fully aroused, it was sufficient to the task and sufficiently resilient. Between 1940 and 1943, this country multiplied its war production by about 25 times. U.S. aircraft production had stood at 5,856 units in 1939. In 1942, the figure reached 25,436. In the year 1944 alone, the United States would produce almost 100,000 aircraft, more than Japan's total production between 1939 and 1945. But again, none of that would count for anything if the American people were not able to summon the will to fight and win a terrible and prolonged war. I'd like to close with a passage from the epilogue of the first book in my trilogy, Pacific Crucible. Golden Gate in 1948, Breadline in 49. That pessimistic slogan, which began circulating in 1942, revealed a great deal of the attitudes of the American servicemen who fought in the Pacific. They fully expected that the war would last twice as long as it eventually did. And they assumed as a matter of course that the long effort would exhaust and bankrupt the nation. But the words also indicated a gritty, persevering determination. The Japanese had fatally misjudged them. They were not cowed by the prospect of a long war and a destitute homecoming. They would go on fighting, killing, and dying, overcoming fear, fatigue, and sorrow until they reached the beaches of the detested empire itself. There, in 1945, the irresistible force of the American war machine would meet the immovable object of the Yamato spirit until two mushroom clouds and an emperor's decision brought the whole execrable business to an end. Thank you all very much.